photographers. In today's tutorial, we're going to talk about how to find your camera's sweet spot. So to start off, we have to learn what a sweet spot is. The sweet spot is going to be your aperture setting of your lens that gives you the sharpest image possible. A common guess is that a sweet spot is 2 to 3 stops above wide open. So if wide open is 2.8, then your best guess might be f8 or f11. The downside about this is that this is just a guess. Guessing is a fine thing to do if it's not your lens or if you don't have the 20 minutes to figure it out. And honestly, shouldn't take you more than 20 minutes to figure this out. So if it's your lens, it's best to really know your equipment. So let's start out with why wide open is not going to give you the sharpest image. There's a thing called chromatic aberration. This is also referred to as color fringing or dispersion. Here's an example of chromatic aberration. So if you look at this picture I took, this is of one of my cameras. Now you can see the bluing color around the buttons, around the hot shoe adapter, around the lettering of the word Nikon. You see that blue? That's not supposed to be there. That's not on the camera. It's not what you want to show up in your picture. Now, this is something that can be fixed in Photoshop, Lightroom. Adobe Camera Raw is probably your best option to use. But that's just adding an extra step. Why do that when you can avoid it? So chromatic aberration happens when colors in the light rays are incorrectly refracted or bent by the lens. You can think of a prism or even Pink Floyd's album cover, The Dark Side of the Moon. In this case, the ray of light is going into the prism and coming out as a rainbow of colors properly. But if the ray was dispersed incorrectly, the colors would come out in a different order. This is why you get the wrong colors around the edges of your image. So, how can this be avoided? To do this, you can just stop down your aperture. But the negative of this is that if you go too far, you end up with lens diffraction. What is lens diffraction? Here's an example. Now, it may be hard to tell in this image looking at it by itself, but when I show you an image that is sharp next to this one, it should become pretty obvious. In this image, you can see around the Nikon, around the hot shoe, around the edges of the camera even, everything just looks a little bit soft. This is a similar problem as chromatic aberration, as it deals with how the light is coming into the lens. When you have your lens stopped down all the way, you have a very small aperture opening, and this causes some of the light rays to hit the sides of the aperture iris and bend around it, leaving you with a softer image. So now we get into how to find your lens's sweet spot. To do this, it's best to use a tripod, although you can find a flat surface to lay your camera on, and then you want to focus on your subject. It is best to use something with lettering, as it will be easier to tell when it's at its sharpest points. I used one of my cameras to focus on the lettering on the front of the camera. Now for the recommended settings, I would recommend that you shoot in aperture priority, so set your ISO to the lowest possible option you have. Most cameras, that option would be 100. I believe I used 80. And now you set your f-stop in its most wide open state. That may be f2.4 or f4. Whatever the most open you have for that aperture setting is what you want to set your f-stop to. Now that you have the settings proper, set your autofocus on the lettering and shoot. Then you move down to your next full f-stop, refocus, and reshoot the same image. You do this until you reach your smallest aperture setting. Now, once you get to the smaller apertures, the shutter speed will increase in how long it takes the camera to capture in the adequate amount of light. The reason I mentioned this is because even on a tripod, just the finger on your camera tripping the shutter could cause the camera shake. You can try to avoid this by setting your timer to something like 2 seconds or 5 to give your camera some time to settle before it opens the shutter. Now, once you're done, you'll take the photos into your computer and you'll have a look at them. Now, if you don't zoom into 100%, you will most likely not notice anything. Just so that you can see what I'm talking about, we're going to go through the images I took together. Alright, so this very first one here I took, I used a Nikon D850, which is a full frame camera. I shot it with a 60mm lens at f2.8 for 1/80th of a second at an ISO of 80. So here's the first one. The picture, honestly, at this distance looks fine. But once you zoom in to 100%, you can start to see, let's zoom in properly, you can start to see right around the buttons, the edge of the camera, the word Nikon, the hot shoe. You see a little bit of blue, a little bit of pinks, stuff like that, colors that aren't supposed to be there. Now let's move up to f4. Again, camera looks good, but then once we're at 100%, you can really see some pink around the Nikon there. Moving on to f5.6, looks good, just like the others have been, but at 100%, actually, that one doesn't look half bad. There's a little bit of pink still around the Nikon, so I probably wouldn't do 5.6, but I might do f6. We'll see what the next one looks like. So f8, that looks really good. Zoomed in, that actually looks really good. So f8 is definitely going to be this lens's sweet spot. Now, is it just f8? No. Like I said, I'd probably use f6 also. So right now I can use f6 up to f8. See what the next one comes out to. This is at f11, and this one, I start seeing a little bit of softness around the lettering. So I probably wouldn't use f11. I'd probably stop at f10. Now, if you want to be precise, you can always shoot every integer of your f-stops so you know exactly where it starts to fall off. I just did full f-stop, so I gotta guess. If I'm really concerned about it, I might go back and reshoot it just so I know exactly which f-stop I need to cut off at. Alrighty, so we know f11 is kind of the end of it. Here's f16 at 100%. You can start to see a little bit of camera shake. That's why I told you use that timer, because that'll help prevent this. But you can also see just a little bit of softness in there as well. This isn't going to screw up my results at all because I already ruled out stopping before this. Here we have f22. That one is definitely camera shake. And then we've got f32, and that one's definitely camera shake also. But if you look at the shutter speed, we're at 1.3 seconds. So that little bit of a bump, that camera held open long enough for that shaking to occur. All right, so then we move on to the crop sensor camera. This is a Nikon D7000. I bought this camera, I think it was my first year of college. This is the camera I used predominantly through school. So this one we're starting off at f2.8. I can tell, even not even being at 100%, that I see some chromatic aberration. I see pink around the Nikon. As you zoom in, it becomes very obvious. So then we look at f4. It's looking better, but I can still see a little bit of pink there. We move on to f5.6. That actually looks pretty good. So for this one, the sweet spot's going to start around 5.6, so just slightly before the other one. We move on to f8, and it still looks really good. Let's zoom in a little bit. Might start getting a little bit soft right there. And then we got f11, and that one is definitely past its distance, so I shouldn't even hit f11. So I'd probably stop this one at f8, f9, something like that. f16, you can see right there, there's no shake in this one, so that one's a good example of diffraction. And then here we're at f22, got a little brighter. I guess the sun blew over me there, but same thing, good example of the diffraction, no camera shake. And then we have f32, and that one, yeah, I don't see any real, well, maybe a little bit of camera shake, but that one's just blown out. That just doesn't look good at all. That's not sharp. That's nothing good on that. So looking at these pictures in progression, you can see why you want to find your sweet spot. And I believe that was the last of my images. So now we have reached the end of this tutorial. So until next time, enjoy your shooting. Drop me a comment if you have any questions, and be sure to subscribe and click the notification icon so you know when I post the next tutorial. Stay safe and happy shooting.